Chapter 2: An Outline History of Philosophy. 1. A history of pre-Marxian philosophy. Each epoch in the life of mankind raised its own philosophical problems, and solved them in its own way, while retaining a certain measure of continuity. Any newly emerging system rejected, in some degree or other, all the previous ones. The history of philosophy can be likened to the growth of a quaint-looking tree, with constantly multiplying branches, each branch having form and color entirely different from the others. Also, the branches of philosophical knowledge that appear to have long gone dead suddenly break into green leaf, bloom, and produce fruit, useful or illusory, as the case may be. The evolution of philosophical ideas is a highly contradictory, though, in the last analysis, progressive process, with numerous rises and declines, ideas far outstripping their day and time, and a great deal of backtracking. It also often happened that progress in one direction was accompanied by retreat in another, which produced curious philosophical systems combining, for example, elements of materialism with idealist explanations and ideas. Old philosophers, especially progressively thinking ones, often raised problems of which the solution demanded several generations of thinkers. On the whole, the history of philosophy is the book of wisdom which, if we read it properly, can help a great deal in the comprehension of contemporary philosophical problems as well. The philosophy of antiquity, at the earliest stage of human culture, linked with the so-called mythological type of thought. The world perception of practically all the ancient peoples rested on a basically idealist attitude. The objects of the material world were treated animistically, and endowed with psychological traits inherent in man himself. But this kind of idealist world perception was not a philosophy in the proper sense. The starting point of philosophical thought proper was spontaneous materialism, which at its beginning quite naturally regards the unity of the infinite diversity of natural phenomena as a matter of course, and seeks it in something definitely corporeal, one rather than in something psychically ideal. The Greek thinker Thales of Miletus, c. 625–547 BC, expressed the idea that all things come from water and turn into water. This natural element was, according to Thales, the primary stuff or principle of all things and the carrier of all changes and transformations. These days, Thales' idea about the first principle appears naive, but historically it was nearly revolutionary, for the proposition everything comes from water neatly discarded the gods of Olympus, and thus ultimately the entire mythological thought, paving the way for a scientific explanation of nature. Thales' successor Anaximander, c. 610 after 547 BC, believed that the first principle of all things was not a concrete matter but primary matter, or a pairon, which meant the unlimited. Another early Greek philosopher, Anaximenes, c. 585–c. 525 BC, believed air to be the primary matter. The same materialist tendency manifested itself, if somewhat later than in European antiquity, in the cultures of the ancient East, where idealist elements were dominant at the time of the birth of philosophy. Ancient Indian materialists, the adherents of Locaita, regarded four elements, earth, water, fire and air, as the first principle of the world. In their view, combinations of these eternal and immutable elements gave an impetus to the development of the universe. The thinkers of ancient China counted wood and metal besides earth, water and fire among the basic elements, owing to a complex intertwining of mythological and spontaneously materialist tendencies. At the early stage of the formation of philosophical concepts, human thought did not know, until a certain moment, marked in Europe by the emergence of the philosophy of Socrates, a clear-cut distinction between materialism and idealism. At this stage, it was merely a question of prevailing tendencies, materialist or idealist. The spontaneity of ancient materialism was evident in that basically materialist propositions often assumed idealist mythological form. But already in those times the conflict between the materialist and idealist explanations of the world was an inner stimulus for the development of philosophy. This latent conflict manifested itself, in particular, in the emergence of ancient dialectics. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, in K. Marx, F. Engels, Collected Works, Volume 25, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1987, page 467. The rudiments of dialectics, also spontaneous in character, were contained in the views of the very first thinkers of both materialist and idealist trends, who had some profound insights into the universal mutability of things, of their transformations into one another. Thus the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, 7th century BC, held the view that, achieving a definite stage of development, everything in the world is transformed into its opposite. The incomplete becomes the complete, the crooked the straight, the empty the full, and vice versa. This replacement of one opposite by another was regarded as a universal law of the movement of things, as an all-embracing flow, eternal emergence and disappearance. The greatest dialectician of the ancient world was Heraclitus of Ephesus, c. 520–460 BC. He taught that everything that exists constantly goes from one state into another. Everything flows and nothing abides. You cannot step twice into the same river. There is nothing fixed in the world. The cold becomes hot, the hot cools off, the wet dries, the dry becomes wet. Emergence and disappearance, life and death, birth and decline, being and non-being are interconnected. They mutually condition each other and pass into each other. At its extreme, the idea of continuous flow resulted in antiquity in the absolute relativism of Cratylus, 5th century BC, who said that one could not step even once into the same river, let alone twice. If everything is flow only, and there is nothing stable, there is nothing that thought can rest on, and knowledge is impossible. Movement outside rest is metaphysics turned inside out. However, Heraclitus himself realized that, even as it changes, a flowing river finds repose. According to his belief, a transition from one state into another proceeds through a struggle of opposites, which he called the eternal universal logos, that is to say, the universal law common to all existence. This universe, which is the same for all, has not been made by any god or man, but it always has been, is, and will be, an ever-living fire, kindling itself by regular measures and going out by regular measures. The dialectics of Heraclitus, who took into account both aspects of any phenomenon, its mutability and its unchangeable nature, was not properly understood by his contemporaries, and was criticized from various standpoints already in antiquity. Cratylus, as we have mentioned, ignored the element of stability, while the Eleatics, Xenophanes, c. 570–478 BC, Parmenides, late 6th–5th cent. BC, and Zeno, the middle of the 5th century BC, focused, on the contrary, on the element of stability, reproaching Heraclitus for exaggerating the role of mutability. Recognizing that the world of sensuous data is unstable and changeable, it is born, it flourishes, and it dies. The Eleatics opposed to this indefinite and unstable sensuous world, the world of indivisible immutable being open to pure reasoning, which alone can be recognized as true being. Because of the spontaneity of the Eleatics' materialism and their tendency to oppose thought to matter, they declared the ideal world to be a realm of metaphysical rest, although they stressed dialectics in relation to the external world. They regarded eternity as an attribute to truth. Thus a dramatic situation in the development of knowledge arose. Some melted down all that exists in the flow of fire, while others crystallized it, as it were, in immutable stone. Thus the ancient philosophers developed the rudiments not only of dialectics but also of metaphysics, which resulted from absolute opposition of matter and thought. Beginning with Heraclitus, materialist and idealist tendencies proper became increasingly distinct in Greek philosophy. The materialist tendency was first philosophically substantiated in the atomistic doctrine of Leucippus and especially Democritus, c. 460 BC. The atomists regarded the world as an integral whole consisting of an infinite number of atoms, tiny, invisible and indivisible particles that move, dash this way and that, are jolted in all directions in void. According to Democritus, atoms are material. They are indivisible owing to their absolute density, extreme smallness and absence of pores within them. They infinitely vary in form, size and weight. Some are rough, others round, still others angular or hook-like. Man's soul also consists of atoms. Democritus believed only these soul atoms are more mobile. They are smaller and rounder than the rest. Atoms and void are the only reality. Combinations of atoms form the entire diversity of nature, including the human soul. Thus Democritus was the first ancient philosopher to overcome the opposition of matter and spirit, through asserting the unitary universal nature of matter and thought. For this reason, the inception of materialism as a philosophical doctrine is linked with the name of Democritus. The atomistic theory explained natural phenomena in terms of natural causes, thus freeing men from the mythological fear of mysterious forces. Democritus taught that the world was not created by any god but existed eternally, that everything in it moved and changed, passing from one state to another through combination and division of atoms, and that all phenomena were subject to causal connections. Democritus rejected a source of motion that would be external with respect to matter. Democritus' atomistic theory of the inner causes of the eternal motion of matter was further developed in Epicurus, 341–270 BC. The movement of atoms, Epicurus said, is determined by their inner property of weight. Still more important was, in his view, the ability of atoms to deviate spontaneously in their movement from the straight line. The spontaneous deviation of atoms was the minimum of freedom in nature, without which not only random phenomena, but also men's free actions, were inexplicable. The rational use of the freedom of action permitted to man consisted, according to Epicurus, in achieving health of body and quietude of mind. The pleasure principle, which he posited as the highest good, was to be implemented through philosophical meditation, since most suffering of the soul came from the fear of death, and the fears caused by the mythological belief in the supernatural divine forces, in the immortality of the soul and in fate. A rational worldview explaining all things by natural causes was necessary to free oneself from these fears and sufferings. The materialist ideas of Democritus and Epicurus were later developed by the ancient Roman thinker Titus Lucretius Carus, c. 99–55 BC. According to Lucretius, the universe is infinite in time and space, although the worlds that form it, including the earth, are temporal, like everything that consists of particles. But life in the universe will never cease. In rejecting the emergence of the world at the will of the gods, Lucretius criticized in fact the idealist religious doctrine of the immortality of the human soul. He was the author of the dictum, "Nothing can be created out of nothing." Although the spontaneous materialism of the ancient thinkers was, on the whole, a great achievement, it has to be pointed out that there were elements of idealist constructions in the philosophy of Democritus, who believed in the existence of gods consisting of atoms of nearly eternal configurations, and who was inclined to a mechanistic interpretation of causality, to the detriment of dialectics. Also in the philosophy of Epicurus, who recognized the existence of gods, and their non-interference in the course of natural phenomena and men's affairs, and in the philosophy of Lucretius, who rejected the interference of gods in earthly life yet recognized the existence in the world of some hidden force beyond the power of the simple principle of causality. Philosophical idealism took shape in the struggle with the materialist worldview. The founder of the consistent philosophical system of objective idealism was Plato, 427–347 BC. According to Plato, only the world of ideas represents true being. While concrete things are something intermediate between being and non-being, they are nothing but the copies of ideas. Ideas were interpreted by Plato as ideal images, models for the sensuously perceived world of things, abstracting ideas from the reason of concrete human beings. Plato declared the world of ideas to be a divine kingdom, in which man's immortal soul existed before his birth. It then went to this mortal earth, where, temporarily abiding in the human body like a prisoner in a dungeon, it recalled the world of ideas. The relationship between thinking and being was turned upside down in Plato's philosophy, and out of this false premise the philosopher deduced the idealist interpretation of the process of cognition. He believed that the senses deceived man, so he advised man to get rid of eyes and ears, and to trust himself to the soul recalling her divine past. Plato's objective idealism was combined with the dialectical method of philosophical reasoning, the dialectics of one and many, of the identical and different, of motion and rest. Characteristic of Plato's philosophy of nature, just as of the Pythagoreans, was its links with number symbolism believed to rule the world of sensual stata. Despite its idealist character, the dialectics of concepts worked out by Plato was of invaluable significance for the subsequent development of dialectical logic. Antiquity, which gave rise to the materialist and idealist lines in philosophy, also produced the first attempts to reconcile these two lines in a single philosophical system. One of the summits of philosophical thought in ancient Greece, in this respect, was the work of Aristotle 384–322 BC, an encyclopedia of ancient science comprising profound materialist and dialectical ideas as well as elements of idealism. The starting point of Aristotle's work on philosophy was opposition to Plato's idealism. It is Aristotle who is said to have declared, "Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth." In his early works, Aristotle substantiated his critique of idealism, endeavoring to overcome the Platonic gap between the world of sensuous things and that of ideas. Recognizing the objective existence of matter, Aristotle regarded it as eternal and impossible to create or destroy. Matter cannot emerge out of nothing, he said. Neither can it increase or decrease quantitatively. In his later works, though, he partially reverted to Plato's world of ideas as the primary matter. In itself matter is passive, Aristotle asserted. It contains merely the potential for the actual diversity of things, in the same way as marble holds the possibility of different statues. In order to turn this possibility into reality, matter must be given the necessary form. The function of form building is performed by the mind, which is the prime mover. By form Aristotle meant the active creative factor preceding the thing and making it real. Form is the stimulus and the goal, the ideal image, the cause of development of diverse things out of uniform matter, and matter is a kind of clay. For all kinds of things to emerge out of clay, a potter is needed, and the potter is God or the mind, the prime mover. The principal mover of the world is God, defined as the form of all forms, as the cause and at the same time the crowning glory of the universe. The later Aristotle thus divorced the form of things from the things themselves, transforming form into an independent substance on the model of Plato's world of ideas. In epistemology, though, Aristotle consistently defended the materialist positions. To study the world means to discover the forms, but to achieve this, we must take as our starting point the reality that is given us, not the forms themselves. Particular things are variable, while their particular forms are invariable. This dictum of Aristotle merges dialectics and metaphysics in a single whole. At the same time, Aristotle was one of the first philosophers to work out a detailed classification of the forms and modes of rational thought. His theory of the most general philosophical concepts, or categories, quantity, quality, relation, essence, time, space, etc., in terms of which he endeavored to express the dialectics of being and thinking, was a great contribution to the theory of scientific knowledge. Aristotle was the founder of formal logic, just as Plato was the founder of dialectical logic. The philosophy of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages cover a long stretch of the history of Europe, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance, nearly a whole millennium. In the early Middle Ages, Christian dogmas evolved along with the formation of the European states after the collapse of the Roman Empire, 5th century AD, while the later Middle Ages, beginning with the 11th century, are associated with the spreading of feudalism, which used Christianity as its ideological basis, clarifying and deepening the details of this worldview in accordance with its own demands. The idealist orientation of most medieval philosophical systems was prompted by the dogmas of Christianity, of which the most important were the dogma of the personal form of the one God, the Creator, which rejected out of hand the atomistic doctrines of antiquity. This dogma was primarily worked out by St. Augustine, and the dogma of the creation of the world by God out of nothing. This last dogma erected an insurmountable barrier between the ideal world of God the Creator and the material world of earthly life. It asserted the latter's derivative origin from the ideal will of the Supreme Being and, moreover, it also assumed the limitedness of the world in time, the beginning and the end of the world. Subject to these harsh dictates of religion supported by state authority, philosophy was declared to be the maidservant of theology. St. Pietro Damiani's formula, expected to use the power of the rational apparatus to confirm the dogmas of Christianity. This philosophy came to be known as scholasticism. Fr. L. Scholasticus learned, Fr. G.K. whole school. All truth was believed to have been given in the biblical texts, so it was necessary to apply a system of correctly constructed syllogisms to actualize that truth by deriving the entire fullness of logical consequences. Naturally, scholasticism relied in this respect on the heritage of antiquity, particularly on Aristotle's formal logic. Since the biblical texts and the symbols of faith were mystical or allegoric in character, their unambiguous interpretation demanded sophisticated logic, a kind of scholastic rationalism, which treated, for example, the dogma of the Trinity, that is of the three hypostases of the one God, as a model of logical problems. The content of scholastic debates had no serious impact on philosophy, but in terms of the technique of reasoning, scholasticism proved very useful for the development of logic. Orthodox scholasticism was systematized by the Dominican monk Thomas Aquinas, who set himself the goal of elaborating the Christian dogmas in the forms of common sense. Relying on the later Aristotle, he canonized the Christian view of the relationship between the ideal and the material as the relation of the original principle of form, the principle of order, to the wavering and unstable principle of matter, the weakest form of being. The merging of the first principle of form and matter gives rise, according to Thomas Aquinas, to the world of individual phenomena. The soul of man is the form-building principle, but it only becomes fully and individually implemented when it is combined with the body. This last proposition put the finishing touch to one of the most acute controversies of Christian scholasticism, a distinctly idealist system as far as its fundamental postulates are concerned. Emergent Christianity, and thus scholasticism as well, were inevitably concerned with their attitude towards matter. For the third hypostasis of the supreme absolute deity, Jesus Christ, was revealed in the form of man, combining both the divine, ideal, and human material corporeal, nature. The very fact of this merging made it impossible to ignore matter entirely as false being, as a nothing, as the dogma of creation out of nothing demanded. Therefore Thomas Aquinas' use of a whole system of sophisticated arguments to qualify matter as the weakest form of being was seen by the Church as a way out of the logical cul-de-sac. Matter was partially justified in scholasticism, while still relegated to a dependent position. But the conflict between matter and spirit was manifested most acutely in the medieval controversy between the realists, Fr. L. realis material, and nominalists, Fr. L. nomen name. The debate was concerned with the nature of universals, or general concepts. The realists Johannes Scotus Erigena, and mostly Thomas Aquinas, relying on Aristotle's proposition that the general exists as indivisibly linked with the individual, being its form, developed the theory of the three kinds of the existence of universals: before things, in divine reason, in the things themselves, of which universals are the essences or forms, and after things, in the human mind, as results of abstraction. This position is known in the history of philosophy as moderate realism, distinct from extreme realism insisting that the general exists only outside things. The extreme realism of the Platonian variety, despite all its apparent suitability to idealist scholasticism, could not be accepted by the Orthodox Church since matter was partially justified in Christianity as one of the two natures of Jesus Christ. The nominalists, like Roscelin, were much more materialistically minded than even the moderate realists. They carried the idea of negation of the objective existence of the general to the logical end, believing that universals only exist in the human mind, in thought. In other words, they rejected not only the presence of the general in a concrete individual thing, but also its existence before the thing, and that was tantamount to the materialist view of the primacy of matter. Universals, Roscelin said, are nothing but the names of things, and their existence is reducible to the vibrations of the vocal cords. Only the individual exists, and only the individual can be the object of knowledge. It was only to be expected that the Church accepted the moderate realism of Thomas Aquinas, while Roscelin's nominalism was condemned already at the Council of Soissons in 1092. Thus, despite the idealist character of the entire medieval philosophy, the confrontation of the lines of Plato and Democritus continued in it, although it was mostly expressed in logical terms. The medieval controversy on the nature of universals had a considerable impact on many philosophical doctrines, especially those of such major thinkers of the modern times as Hobbes and Locke. Elements of nominalism also occur in Spinoza, while the technique of the nominalist critique of the ontologism of universals was used by Berkeley and Hume. In the shaping of the doctrine of subjective idealism, the realist proposition concerning the presence of general concepts in human consciousness later formed the basis of idealist rationalism of Leibniz and Descartes, while the idea of the ontological independence of universals was absorbed by classical German idealism. Medieval philosophy made a significant contribution to further development of epistemology by working out and clarifying all the logically possible versions of the relations between the rational, the empirical, and the a priori, the relations which later became not just the theme of scholastic arguments, but the basis for natural scientific and philosophical knowledge. The philosophy of the Renaissance, the growth of industry, commerce, navigation, and the military arts, that is the development of material production, conditioned the progress in the technical sciences. In natural science, mathematics, and mechanics, all this required the freeing of reason from scholasticism, and a transition from purely logical problems to natural scientific cognition of the world and man. This tendency was manifested in the views of the major thinkers of the Renaissance, permeated with the idea of humanism. Nicholas of Cusa asserted the power of human knowledge. Through the creative activity of his mind, a man is his intellect. Man became like God, as it were. The idea of Nicholas of Cusa, that in God there is a coincidence of opposites, is close in content to dialectics, as is the idea of the relationship between part and whole. The particular indicates the pre-existence of the whole. He also meditated on the boundaries of applying the law of contradiction in mathematical knowledge, and on the possibility of using mathematical concepts in the study of nature. For Pico della Mirandola, the central idea was elevation of man through his involvement in all things terrestrial and celestial. The fact that man is free in his choices makes him cosmically unbound, and asserts his creative capacity for self-determination. The pantheistic views of that thinker were close to those of Nicholas of Cusa. Nicholas Copernicus is universally known for the revolution he brought about in astronomy, by asserting the heliocentric system. Michel de Montaigne, author of the famous essays, endeavored to prove that human thought must be constantly perfected on the basis of objective cognition of the laws of nature, to which the lives and activities of men were also subject. His skepticism was the symbol of the restlessness of intellect, of constant creative search. Giordano Bruno also believed nature, not God, to be the goal of philosophical knowledge, and he expressed the idea that nature and the number of worlds in the universe were infinite. He held pantheist views. And he was not averse to the dialectical idea of the coincidence of opposites. Galileo was one of the founders of experimental theoretical natural science. He laid the foundations of classical mechanics. In epistemology, he believed that two methods, analysis and subsequent synthesis, had to be used in the movement from the sensuous perception of natural phenomena to their theoretical understanding. True knowledge appears as the unity of the synthetic and the analytical, of the sensuous and the abstract. All this, taken together, changed men's views of the world and the position of man in it, imposing a deep imprint on the character of all subsequent science and philosophy. In this epoch, the philosophical ideas of antiquity were born anew, as it were. The old involvement with man, and the old spontaneous materialist tendencies were revived on a new historico-cultural soil, enriched by the influence of medieval Arabic culture, by the emergence and strengthening of university science along with monastery schools. Another factor here was the needs of socio-historical practice, which gave a powerful impulse to the development of the natural sciences and the humanities, in which the foundations of the experimental natural science of the modern times were laid. The European philosophy of the 17th and 18th centuries. The development of experimental knowledge demanded the replacement of the scholastic method of thinking by a new one, directly addressed to the real world. The principles of materialism and elements of dialectics were revived and developed in a new atmosphere. Increasing knowledge of nature confirmed the truth of materialism and rejected the basic propositions of idealism, but the one pantheism, G.K. Pan all, theos God, identification of the world and God, everything is. Materialism of those times was mechanistic and metaphysical. Since other sciences, such as chemistry and biology, were at the embryonic stage, the standpoint of the most advanced sciences of those times, mechanics and mathematics, naturally seemed universal. The thinkers of that period saw mechanics as the key to the mystery of the entire universe. The application of the mechanical method resulted in striking progress in the cognition of the physical world. The notion of the mechanical determinedness of natural phenomena was greatly consolidated by the powerful influence of Newton's discoveries, as his views were based on a sound mathematical substantiation of mechanical causality. Mechanics, however, knows only motion, it does not know development. That was why the method of thinking used by philosophers was largely metaphysical in those times. 2. The English philosopher Francis Bacon, the founder of materialism in the modern times, believed that philosophy had to be above all practical. Where it remained scholastic and speculative, it was not true. Bacon said of schoolmen that their wit and mind works upon itself, as the spider works his web, admirable for the fineness of thread and work but of no substance or profit. It was Bacon who kindled the torch of new knowledge based on the methodology of experimental natural science, which he asserted as the pledge of man's future power and dominion over nature. Man can only master nature by obeying her laws. The conclusions of science must be based on facts, and serve as the basis for broad generalization. The inductive method, introduced by Bacon and implying observation, analysis, comparison, experiment, fully suited experimental knowledge. Experience can only provide reliable knowledge if the mind is free of certain false idols. The idols of the tribe are errors following from the fact that man judges nature on the analogy of man's life. The idols of the cave are errors of individual character depending on education, tastes, and habits of individuals. The idols of the marketplace are the habits of basing judgments of the world on common notions and opinions and critically absorbed. The idols of the theatre are linked with blind faith in authorities. Never invoke anyone's authority. That was the principle of the science of the modern times, which upheld Horace's motto, "I am not bound over to swear allegiance to any master." Bacon believed that the true connection between things lay in natural causality. However, it is important to note Bacon's theological inconsistency. While proclaiming materialist principles, Bacon permitted the existence of God, and gave a largely idealist interpretation of the laws of social life. Bacon's materialism was further developed and defended by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. According to Hobbes, matter is eternal but individual bodies are temporary. He saw the motion of matter as the movement of bodies in space, that is to say, as mechanical motion, and he viewed not only all natural bodies but also man and society as mechanisms. Unlike Bacon, Hobbes resolutely rejected religion, and believed it to be incompatible with science. Although his view of religion was not consistent, he reserved for it a place in society as a means of holding the masses in check. Besides, Hobbes' materialism was metaphysical, thus, in his interpretation of motion, as the result of collision of two bodies, he was practically inclined to the theory of the first push given by God, a standpoint known as deism. 1. Hobbes believed that all knowledge is attained through sensations, but in his epistemological writings he stressed the importance of reason, and especially the mathematical operations of intellect. As we have seen, Bacon mostly worked on the method of empirical, experimental study of nature, while Hobbes somewhat extended the boundaries of Bacon's empiricism by turning to mathematics. Now, René Descartes, the French scientist and philosopher, placed reason first, reducing the role of experience to that of mere practical verification of the data of intellect. He endeavored to work out a universal method for all sciences on the basis of the theory of rationalism, 2, which assumed the existence in the human mind of innate ideas, largely determining the results of cognition. He counted among innate ideas most of the foundations of mathematics and logic. For example, things which are equal to the same thing are equal to one another. Descartes' view of nature was mechanistic in character. To him, the universe was one enormous mechanism, a changeable one, and with a history of development of its own. The first push to the existence and development of the world is given by God, but the world's later development is determined by the independent creative force of matter. Descartes was one of the first to work out the idea of evolution, albeit on a mechanistic basis, and he one deism, implemented that idea in all the areas of the science of nature, from the formation of the celestial bodies to the emergence of plants, animals and man. The stars and planetary systems were formed, according to Descartes, by the vortical motion of matter. World matter is infinite, homogeneous, it has no empty spaces, and is divisible ad infinitum. At this point, Descartes was one of the first to approach the idea of material unity of the universe. Matter is in constant quantitative and qualitative motion determined by the universal laws of mechanics. The organic world is subject to the same laws. Animals are no more than complex machines. Unlike animals, man is endowed with reason and speech, which go beyond the sphere of the action of mechanical laws. To explain these phenomena, Descartes had to admit, along with material substance or extension, the existence of God and of a spiritual, thinking substance derivative from God, that is, of the soul. Dualism is thus a characteristic feature of Cartesian philosophy. To Descartes, the first question of philosophy was that of the possibility of true knowledge, and the problem of method through which such knowledge can be obtained. In dealing with this issue, Descartes had to overcome philosophical skepticism. In the nature of cognition, it is precisely the imperative of doubt embracing all knowledge that leads to the assertion of the possibility of reliable knowledge. Realizing that I am probably deceived by someone very powerful and cunning, Descartes reasons, I begin to doubt everything, but I cannot doubt that I doubt. I cannot doubt that my doubt and thought exist. Hence Descartes' famous dictum, I think, therefore I am. He reaches out towards the truth of the being of things through the truth of the thought and existence of the thinking being. Descartes' method of scientific cognition is called analytical, or rationalist. This method requires clarity and consistency in the operations of thought itself ensured by mathematics. Division of the object of thought into elementary parts studied first separately and then the motion of thought from the simple to the complex. No boundaries should be set to the human mind, says Descartes. There is nothing so distant that it could not be reached, nor anything so secret that it could not be discovered. The materialist aspects of Descartes' views were further developed by the Dutch philosopher Benedict Spinoza, who opposed materialist monism to dualism. He resolutely rejected one monism, FRGK, monos one, the philosophical system which explains all the diversity of the world in terms of one substance only, either matter or spirit. The concept of thought as a special substance existing by itself and manifesting itself through itself, God, the ideal and the material merged in Spinoza in a single infinite substance, a position known as naturalist pantheism. Spinoza asserted that there exists a single substance outside consciousness, one that is the cause of itself causa sui, and does not need any other causes. The God of Spinoza is inseparable from nature and entirely devoid of any properties of person. The necessity of causes and consequences following from the inner laws of substance is the only principle of the world order. The single substance possesses two cognizable attributes or inalienable properties, extension and thought. Matter has extension, and matter, beginning with stone and ending with the human brain, is capable of thought, although in varying degrees. Human thought is a particular case of thought in general, and that is a position known as hylozoism. Spinoza interpreted thought as the self-consciousness of nature, and this made his position monistic, hence the principle of the knowability of the world, and the profound conclusion that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. The wider the range of things with which man comes in contact, that is, the more active the subject, the more perfect the thought. The measure of the perfection of thought is determined by the measure of its agreement with the general laws of nature, and correctly cognized general forms and laws of the world are the true rules of thought. To understand a thing means to perceive the universal element underlying its individuality. It means to proceed from modus to substance. Reason endeavors to grasp in nature the inner harmony of causes and consequences. This harmony is knowable when reason, not content with direct observation, proceeds from the entire totality of impressions. By defining nature as the only basis or substance whose being follows from its essence, Spinoza put aside as irrelevant the question of the origin of nature, and thus of God as the creator, challenging the pivotal dogma of Christianity concerning creation out of nothing. Spinoza's only concession to the times was his use of words. He called nature God and God nature. Apart from Spinoza's great achievement, demonstrating the substantial unity of the world, his views also contain certain elements of a dialectical world perception, of the unity of the finite and the infinite, of one and many, of one high necessity and freedom. It was Spinoza who produced this classical formula. Freedom is a recognized necessity. The English philosopher John Locke was against subordinating knowledge to revelation. He insisted that faith could have no authority in the face of clear and obvious experimental data. He considered the idea of God vague and uncertain, and rejected the notion of innate ideas, believing that the source of all our knowledge is experience and sensation. Men are not born with ready-made ideas. The mind of a newborn baby is a tabula rasa on which life draws its patterns, that is, knowledge. In this way Locke substantiated sensualism, one opposed to the rationalism of Descartes. There is nothing in the mind that was not earlier in the sensations. That was Locke's main postulate. Sensations are produced by the action of external things on our sense organs. That is what external experience consists in. As for the inner experience, or reflection, it is the mind's observation of its own activity, and the modes of the manifestation of this activity. But Locke's interpretation of inner experience was influenced by rationalism. He conceded that a certain spontaneous force independent of experience was inherent in the mind, and that reflection generated the ideas of existence, time, and number, while rejecting innate ideas as extra-experimental and pre-experimental knowledge. Locke recognized the existence in reason of certain inclination or predisposition for a given kind of activity. He singled out three kinds of knowledge according to the degree of its obviousness: actual sensuous or immediate knowledge of individual things, demonstrative knowledge attained through inference, as for example through comparison and relationship between concepts, and the highest kind, intuitive knowledge or direct evaluation by reason of the correspondence or lack of correspondence between ideas. Developing Hobbes' ideas on the connection between language and thought, he proposed the concept of semiotics as a general theory of signs and their role in knowledge. He made a vast impact, not only on the subsequent development of materialistically oriented philosophy, but also largely determined the further developments in pedagogics and psychology, through his pioneering studies in the dialectics of the innate and the social world. 1. Sensualism, Fr. Sense. The German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz developed the ideas of objective idealism contained in Plato's Heritage. He expressed certain profound ideas of dialectical nature. He insisted, for instance, that the world consists of tiny elements or monads, spiritual elements of being possessing activeness and independence, continually changing and capable of suffering, perception and consciousness, as distinct from Spinoza. Leibniz thus added to the concept of substance that of active force, or the Aristotelian principle of the self-motion of matter. But Leibniz removed the pantheistically perceived God from Spinoza's single substance. According to Leibniz, God towers above the corporeal world, being its culprit and master. The unity and agreement among the monads is the result of divinely pre-established harmony. Thus the lower monads have but the vaguest representations, that is the state which the inorganic world and the vegetable kingdom are in. In animals, the representations reach the stage of sensation, and in man, that of clear understanding, of reason, attributing to monads active force as their principal property, establishing the energy links between them, and, on the other hand, defending the idea of God the Creator. Leibniz through theology arrived at the principle of the inseparable and universal, absolute connection of matter and motion, rejecting the notion of space and time as self-contained principles of being existing apart from matter, and independently of it. He regarded space as the order of mutual arrangement of a multitude of individual bodies existing outside one another, and time as the order in which phenomena or states of bodies succeed one another. One of the major achievements of Leibniz's philosophy was his theory of an individual monad, as a concentrated world, as a mirror of the one infinite universe. Despite the idealist basis of Leibniz's system, his dialectics of the general and the individual was highly appreciated in dialectical materialism. In his logical studies, Leibniz worked out a rational logical symbolism, and revealed the structure and laws of proof, as one of the fundamental devices used by rational cognition. He was one of the founders of modern symbolic and mathematical logic. The 17th and 18th centuries in England were marked by the development of idealist sensualism, of which the most prominent proponents were George Berkeley and David Hume. A convinced adherent of religion, Berkeley undertook a critique of the notion of matter, relying, on the one hand, on extreme nominalism, and thus challenging the authority of Thomas Aquinas, who asserted moderate realism in Christianity, and on the other, on a one-sided interpretation of Locke's sensualism. He considered the concept of matter to be general and therefore false, for underlying it is the assumption that we can ignore the particular properties of things constituting the content of our sensations. and form an abstract idea of matter in general as the substratum common to all of them. However, we perceive not matter as such but only the individual properties of things, taste, smell, color, etc., of which the perceptions Berkeley called ideas. The things surrounding us exist as ideas in the mind of God, who is the cause and the source of earthly life. Berkeley's subjective idealism is a logical confusion of religious idealist views and the one-sided elements of nominalism and sensualism. In order to avoid solipsist conclusions from these premises, Berkeley introduced the concept of collective consciousness, which is determined by God. Here Berkeley relied on realism and even rationalism, but this concession to objective idealism did not change the essence of his doctrine, which remained subjective idealist. Hume developed a system somewhat different from Berkeley's but also essentially subjective idealist, directed primarily towards agnosticism. To the question whether the external world existed, Hume gave an evasive answer: "I do not know." He believed that man could not go beyond his own sensations and understand something outside himself. For Hume, true knowledge could only be logical. While the objects of study concerning facts could not be proved logically, being derived from experience, Hume interpreted experience as a flow of impressions whose cause was unknown and unknowable. Inasmuch as experience cannot be logically substantiated, experimental knowledge is unreliable. Thus experience can produce first one impression of a certain phenomenon and then another. But the fact that one phenomenon precedes another in experience cannot logically prove that the former is the cause of the latter. In itself, this proposition is indubitably correct. From this, though, Hume drew the erroneous conclusion that the objective character of causality was unknowable. Rejecting objective causality, he recognized at the same time subjective causality in the form of generation of ideas, memory images, by sense impressions. Eventually Hume lost all criteria of the truth of knowledge, and was forced to declare belief, rather than theoretical knowledge, to be the source of practical certainty. Thus we are practically certain that the sun rises every day. This certainty comes from the habit of seeing this phenomenon repeated every day. Hume applied Berkeleyan critique of the idea of substance not only to matter but also to ideal being, and this developed into critique of the church and religious faith. The second half of the 18th century was an epoch of acute aggravation of the conflict between the feudal and bourgeois worldviews, particularly in France. This conflict came to a head in the bourgeois revolution. Ideologically, it was prepared in the works of the 18th century French philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, La Mettrie, Helvetius, and Holbach. They resolutely fought against religion and the socio-political order in contemporary France, overcoming the inconsistencies of Locke and rejecting the idealism of Berkeley. The materialistically minded French philosophers defended materialism in its mechanistic form, although some of their views contained elements of dialectics, cf. for example, Diderot's conception of the development of organisms. According to that theory, nature, or matter, is the cause of everything. It exists by itself, and it will continue to exist and to act eternally. It is its own cause. All material bodies consist of atoms. In relation to man, matter is everything that acts in one way or another on the sense organs. The 18th century French philosophers regarded religion as a spiritual weapon of enslaving the people, and a tool in the hands of the tyranny. The path of liberation of the people from religion and prejudice lay through enlightenment. At this point they were close to the principles of atheism, and to an understanding of the need for a revolutionary transformation of social life. Man and the personal qualities of man depended on the environment, so his vices were also the result of the environment. To remold man, to free him from shortcomings, and to develop his positive aspects, it was necessary to transform the environment, in the first place social environment. This doctrine played a great role in the philosophical substantiation of the ideas of utopian socialists. Classical German philosophy. At the turn of the 19th century, Germany, overcoming its economic and political backwardness, was nearing a bourgeois revolution. Just as in France, the socio-economic revolution was preceded by a philosophical one. An important role in the formation of classical German philosophy was played by the achievements of natural science and the social sciences. Chemistry and physics began to develop, and the study of organic nature made considerable advance. Mathematical discoveries which afforded an understanding and precise quantitative expression of natural processes. Lamarck's theory of the conditioning of the organism's evolution by the environment, astronomical, geological, and embryological theories, as well as theories of human society. All this pushed into the foreground, resolutely and inevitably, the idea of development as a theory and as a method of cognition of reality. Immanuel Kant was one of the greatest minds mankind ever knew and the founder of classical German idealism. It was with Kant that the dawn of the philosophy of the modern times broke. But he was a shrewd and profound thinker not only in philosophy. His theory of the origin of the solar system, out of a giant gas nebula, still remains one of the fundamental scientific ideas in astronomy. Kant's natural scientific works broke down the wall of the metaphysical explanation of nature, as he made his attempt to apply the principles of contemporary natural science, not only to the structure of the universe, but also to the history of its origin and development. Apart from this, he put forward the idea of lining up animals in the order of their possible origin, and the idea of natural origin of the human races. Kant believed that the solution of the problems of being, of morality and religion, must be preceded by a study in the possibilities of human knowledge, and the boundaries of human knowledge. According to Kant, the necessary conditions of knowledge are inherent in reason itself, forming the basis of knowledge. It is these conditions that lend knowledge the properties of necessity and universality. They are also the absolute boundaries of reliable knowledge. Kant distinguished between the appearances of things, as they are perceived by man, and the things as they exist by themselves. We do not study the world as it is in reality, but only as it appears to us. Only phenomena constituting the content of our experience are accessible to our knowledge. The impact of things in themselves on our sense organs results in a chaos of sensations, which is brought to unity and order by the power of reason. What we regard as the laws of nature are in actual fact the connection brought into the world of phenomena by reason. In other words, reason prescribes laws to nature, but corresponding to the world of phenomena is the essence of things independent of human consciousness, or things in themselves. Absolute knowledge of these is impossible. To us, they are only noumena, that is to say, intelligible essences not given in experience. Kant did not share the boundless belief in the power of human reason, referring to this belief as dogmatism. He believed there was a certain moral sense in the fundamental limitations of human knowledge. If man were endowed with absolute knowledge, he would face neither risk nor struggle in the performance of his moral duty. Kant was convinced that the ideas of time and space are known to man before perception. Space and time are ideal, not real. Sense impressions are interconnected by means of judgments based on categories or general concepts, which, according to Kant, are purely logical forms characterizing pure thought and not its subject. The categories are given to man before all experience, that is to say, a priori. One dialectics figured prominently in Kant's epistemology. Contradiction was regarded as a necessary element of cognition, but dialectics was for Kant merely an epistemological principle. It was subjective as it did not reflect the contradictions of the things themselves, merely the contradictions of intellectual activity. Kant's philosophy was not free from compromise with idealism. Endeavoring to reconcile science and religion, Kant said he had to limit the domain of knowledge to give room to faith. After Kant, classical German philosophy was developed by such outstanding philosophers as Fichte and Schelling. Both of them tried to overcome the Kantian opposition of phenomenon and noumenon by grounding cognitive activeness in some unitary principle, the absolute ego, as in Fichte, or the absolute identity of being and thinking, as in Schelling. The latter carried out a subtle analysis of the categories of dialectics, such as freedom and necessity, identity, one and many. This analysis anticipated Hegelian objective idealist dialectics. Schelling's studies in the philosophy of nature made a great impact on the minds of natural scientists. The highest achievement of classical German philosophy was the dialectics of Hegel. He developed, on an objective idealist basis, a theory of the laws and categories of dialectics, and was the first to work out in systematic form the fundamental principles of dialectical logic. Criticizing the metaphysical method of thought that dominated both idealist and materialist doctrines of those times, he opposed the dialectical principle that the essence manifests itself phenomenally, and that phenomena are essential to one. The essence of Kantian a priorism is that the subject of knowledge possesses certain forms of knowledge that evolved before him. But this a priorism is not identical with the concept of innate ideas. A priori elements are Kant's thing in itself. Hegel asserted that categories are objective forms of reality underlying which is the world reason, absolute idea, or the world spirit. That is the active principle that gave the impetus to the emergence and development of the world. The activity of the absolute idea consists in thinking, and the goal, in self-cognition. In the process of self-cognition, the world reason goes through three stages: the existence of the self-cognizing idea in its own womb. In the element of pure thought, this is logic, in which the idea reveals its content in a system of laws and categories of dialectics. The development of the idea in the form of other being, as natural phenomena. It is not nature that develops but only the categories. The development of the idea in thought and in the history of mankind, the history of the spirit. At this last stage, the absolute idea reverts to itself, perceiving itself in the form of human consciousness and self-consciousness. Hegel's philosophical ideas are permeated with the idea of development. He believed that it was impossible to understand a phenomenon without a clear picture of the whole path which it traversed in its development, that development does not run along a closed circuit but proceeds from lower forms to higher ones, that in this process quantitative changes turn into qualitative ones, and that the source of development lies in contradiction, which sets the world in motion. Contradiction is the root of all motion and all vitality. It is the principle of all self-motion. Hegel's philosophical system presented reality as a chain of dialectical transitions. However, there is a deep inner contradiction in Hegel's philosophy. What contradiction is that? Hegel's method is directed towards the infinity of cognition. Since the objective basis is the absolute spirit, and the goal, the self-cognition of that spirit, cognition is finite and limited. In other words, passing through a system of cognitive stages, the system of cognition is crowned by the last stage, that of self-cognition, of which the realization is Hegel's system of philosophy itself. The contradiction between Hegel's method and system is a contradiction between the finite and the infinite. This contradiction in Hegel is by no means dialectical, for it does not become the source for further development. The classics of Marxism-Leninism subjected Hegel's idealism to acute and comprehensive critique, but at the same time they highly appreciated the positive elements contained in his work. Above all his dialectics, a different trend was represented in the system of Ludwig Feuerbach, the greatest materialist of the pre-Marxian epoch and the last representative of classical German philosophy. Criticizing Hegel's objective idealism, Feuerbach propounded the materialist view of nature. Materialism is just as old and omnipresent as mankind itself. It is as clear as daylight, as necessary as bread and water, and as inevitable and unavoidable as air. However, Feuerbach's critique of Hegel was one-sided. Rejecting Hegel's idealism, Feuerbach underestimated his dialectics. Feuerbach's materialism remained traditionally metaphysical. Its characteristic feature was anthropologism, the view of man as the highest product of nature, the tendency to consider man in an indivisible unity with nature. Nature is the basis of spirit. It must also be the basis of philosophy called upon to reveal the earthly essence of man, whom nature endowed with senses and reason and whose psyche depends on his physical constitution, possessing at the same time a qualitative specificity irreducible to the physiological processes. Feuerbach's anthropologism also played a great role in the struggle against the idealist interpretations of man, against the dualistic opposition of man's spiritual element to the corporeal one, and against vulgar materialism. But the natural side of man was exaggerated, and the social one, underestimated. In his critique of agnosticism, Feuerbach assumed that human thought correctly reflects the reality existing outside consciousness. The senses play the most important part in his epistemology. Only the sensuous is as clear as the sun. To think means to connect one sense organ datum with another. Feuerbach regarded all forms of cognition, sensations, representations, concepts, ideas, as images or copies of things, of their properties and relations. Feuerbach's anthropological materialism was metaphysical in nature. It was passively contemplative, and did not take into account socio-historical practice. For this, Marx criticized him in his theses on Feuerbach. One of Feuerbach's achievements was the fact that he showed up the links between idealism and religion, demonstrating that their root lay in divorcing thinking from being and transforming ideas into independent essences. Feuerbach subjected the origin and essence of religion to a profound and striking analysis, but he traced their roots only to man's psychology, his consciousness and emotions. In the first place, the feeling of love. A human being is God to another human being. Although Feuerbach noted that political, economic, ethical and other social factors impose their imprint on the content of religion, he failed to demonstrate what its true social roots are too. The emergence and development of the philosophy of Marxism. The philosophy of Marxism was evolved by the great revolutionary thinkers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and further developed by Vladimir Lenin. The emergence of Marxism was a revolutionary upheaval in philosophy and in social science as a whole, and a natural result of the entire preceding history. The philosophy of Marxism did not take shape as a mechanical accumulation of the grains of truth, in a kind of philosophical money box, but as a consistent theory resulting from the processing, critical re-interpretation and creative development of these previously found truths under the new historical conditions. The historical conditions of the emergence of Marxism. By the middle of the 19th century, the bourgeois revolutions were already over. Capitalism was developing intensely on its own basis. Major industrial enterprises were emerging. It was the time of the formation of the proletariat, whose working conditions were hard and sometimes unbearable. The real significance of the social activity of the working class increased sharply. Class conflicts were growing more acute. Weavers' uprisings erupted in Lyons, France, and in German Silesia. The Chartist movement in England assumed great scope, but working-class actions were still mostly spontaneous and unorganized. The working class lacked clear class self-awareness, and a scientific understanding of the paths and methods of its economic and social emancipation. The unorganized and disjoint actions of the proletariat had to be combined with the scientific theory of socialism, through the setting up of mass workers' parties, the advance guard capable of leading the rest of the working class in the assault on capitalism. The proletariat could only free itself by destroying the economic conditions of the exploitation of man by man. Marx and Engels came to the conclusion that the working class had the world historic mission, and that a revolutionary transition from capitalism to socialism was inevitable. This conclusion could only be drawn on the basis of careful scientific study of the laws of social development, and it assumed the elaboration of a new worldview and methodology. The theoretical sources of the philosophy of Marxism. Great ideas never spring up in a vacuum, they have their sources. As Engels pointed out, highly important for the theoretical substantiation of the philosophy of Marxism was the dialectical materialist view of nature. greatly stimulated by the outstanding discoveries of natural science, the discovery of the law of preservation and transformation of energy by Mikhail Lomonosov and Julius Mayer, of the cellular structure of living organisms by Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, and the development of the evolutionary theory by Charles Darwin. Marx and Engels viewed the law of preservation and transformation of energy as confirmation of the principles of the material unity of the world, of the eternity and indestructibility of matter, of the mutual transitions of different forms of its being. As for the cellular structure of living organisms, they saw it as proof of the inner unity of the vegetable and animal kingdoms, and Darwin's theory as a triumph of the idea of development. However, in developing their theories, Marx and Engels relied not only on natural science but also, and in the first place, on the achievements of social science. The theoretical sources of Marxism are classical German philosophy, classical English political economy, and French utopian socialism. The direct predecessors who made the greatest impact on their philosophical views were Hegel and Feuerbach. In a changed form, Hegel's dialectical ideas became the philosophical source of materialist dialectics. Marx noted that the mystification which dialectics suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. 1. In their critique of Hegel's idealist views, Marx and Engels relied on the whole of the materialist tradition, and above all on Feuerbach's materialism. Dialectical materialism is precisely the result of a radical creative transformation of Hegel's and Feuerbach's systems, on the basis of a new interpretation of social and natural reality. The ideas of the outstanding English economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who laid the foundations of the economic anatomy of bourgeois society, and substantiated the labor theory of value, helped Marx and Engels to evolve the consistently scientific social philosophy of historical materialism. The conflicts between the rich and the poor, between labor and capital, had long caused angry protests among noble people, who dreamed of social justice. A striking expression of that protest in the history of social thought was utopian socialism. Its major reper 1K. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1975, page 29. Sensitives, Charles Fourier, Claude Henri Saint, Simon and Robert Owen, subjected the contradictions of capitalism to profound and acute criticism, and express certain brilliant ideas about the new, socialist society, in particular, about public ownership of the means of production, elimination of exploitation of man by man, about making labor a source of enjoyment, etc. But they saw no real force that could implement socialist transformations. Marx and Engels saw it in the proletariat, a new class entering the scene of world history. The system of scientific views on the objective laws of the development of nature and society, and on the revolutionary transformation of social reality, was termed Marxism, of which the constituent parts are dialectical and historical materialism, Marxist political economy, and the theory of scientific socialism. The essence of the revolutionary upheaval carried out by Marxism in philosophy, the emergence of the philosophy of Marxism, marked a qualitative change in the content and social significance of philosophical thought, in the entire system of scientific knowledge, and practical transformation of reality. Marx and Engels firmly linked revolutionary theory with revolutionary practice. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, the point is to change it. This brief formula contains the gist of the radical upheaval in philosophy. This proposition in no way depreciates the great revolutionary contribution of the previous progressive philosophical ideas. It merely points out the fact that, because of their idealist explanations of history, or pre-Marxian philosophical systems failed to create a science that would reveal the laws of restructuring human society. Marxism showed the fundamental role of social practice in the development of the entire material, spiritual and intellectual culture of mankind. Deducing theory from practice, Marxism subordinated it to the interests of a revolutionary transformation of the world. Theory becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. The philosophy of Marxism merged with revolutionary struggle, and its creators became the ideologues and political leaders of the proletariat. Marx and Engels created a philosophy of the masses and scientifically substantiated the decisive role of the people in history, without underestimating in the least the role of historical personalities. The emergence of Marxism signified the end of metaphysical materialism. For the first time in the history of philosophy, materialist dialectics was evolved and creatively applied to concrete problems, recognizing the primacy of matter and nature and the secondary and derivative character of consciousness. Materialists of previous times had not been consistent in their treatment of society. They remained idealists. Marxism showed that people were creators of their history, only they created history in accordance with objective social laws, not arbitrarily. People's being, that is, the material production and the relations between them in the process of labor that take shape on this basis, determines their consciousness. Having generalized the experiences of the proletariat's revolutionary struggle and the data of science, Marx and Engels demonstrated the dialectical materialist character of development of nature and of human society. They completed the edifice of materialism by applying it to social history, and in this way created historical materialism. This was of great revolutionary significance both for the science of society and for the entire social practice. An integral theory of the laws of the development of nature, society and thought, the philosophy of dialectical and historical materialism, was created. The creative character of Marxist philosophy. The thinkers of the past often aspired to construct complete theories, intended to provide exhaustive answers to all questions, but these claims were in conflict with life, eternally flowing and changeable. To a creatively thinking intellect, the greatness of philosophy lies in that it cannot in principle be completed. Any theoretical claims to ultimate truths doom the philosopher to estrangement from life, and escape into the desert of dogmatism. Marxist philosophy is a creative theory. It is not a dogma but a guide to action. This brief formula stresses the aspect of Marxism that must always be borne in mind, otherwise we make Marxism one-sided, ugly, and dead, removing its living soul and undermining its theoretical foundation. Dialectics, the doctrine of historical development through contradictions. We undermine its links with definite practical tasks of the times, which may, and are actually bound to, change at each new turn of history. The development of Marxist philosophy by Lenin. The work of Lenin marks a new stage in the philosophy of Marxism. Lenin lived and worked at a time when history made a sharp turning, and a new socio-economic formation was born. Capitalism reached its imperialist stage. Social conflicts became acutely aggravated. The international revolutionary movement rose to a higher level. All this posed new tasks before philosophy and practice. In solving them, Lenin made a contribution to the development of the basic principles of dialectical and historical materialism, creatively worked out the philosophical foundations of the theory of scientific socialism, deepened the Marxist theory of the party and implemented it in reality, and analyzed the principal traits of the epoch in which he lived. Lenin defined the tasks of the strategy and tactics of the proletariat, in strict accordance with the premises of his dialectical materialist worldview. Already in his early works, What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats, the economic content of Nerodism and the criticism of it in Mr. Struve's book, etc., Lenin greatly enriched the social philosophy of Marxism. In criticizing the Narodnik's one-idealist views of society, after the defeat of the 1905–1907 revolution, Russia was swamped by political reaction. which tried to take away the working class movement's organizational and ideological weapons. In this situation, attempts were made to boost the influence of religion on the consciousness of the masses, and various idealist systems, neo-Kantianism, pragmatism, intuitivism, and especially empirio-criticism, gained currency. The views of Ernst Mach and Richard Avenarius had a significant influence in those days on the minds of scientists. Revisionists endeavored to prove that Marxism had no philosophy of its own, and that it had to be supplemented by Machist epistemology. Defense of materialist philosophical principles became an urgent task. It was carried out in Lenin's work Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, which contained a scientific, dialectical materialist analysis of contemporary natural science. It demonstrated that natural-scientific discoveries confirmed some well-known propositions of dialectical materialism and, moreover, pointed out certain new conclusions that philosophers had to draw on the evidence of those discoveries. Of substantive methodological significance are Lenin's propositions concerning the inexhaustibility of the atom, and the unnerodniks, fr. Rosnerod people, adherents of a petty limitedness of the cognition of matter in depth and in breadth, and his definition of matter. Lenin's book developed a number of propositions of Marxist epistemology and historical materialism, the concept of practice, the problem of truth, the principal methods and devices of cognition, etc. In the years of the First World War, Lenin wrote his philosophical notebooks, of which the principal content is a deeper interpretation of dialectics and especially of its nucleus, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites, of its categories and laws. In this connection, Lenin studied the rational content of the theories of Heraclitus, Aristotle, and Hegel. Lenin's attention was principally focused on the dialectics of the process of cognition, of thought. Lenin's work in the field of social philosophy was linked with the need for a theoretical analysis of the imperialist stage. In the development of capitalism, philosophical weapons had to be sharpened in preparation for the fight against opportunism. That was why Lenin, as he reflected on problems of dialectics, was also concerned with socio-philosophical issues, the future of imperialism, relations among nations, the struggle of the peoples for peace, the theory and practice of the socialist revolution. Relying on the laws of imperialism which he discovered, Lenin substantiated the idea of real possibility of the victory of socialism first in several or even one single country. This idea of his made a great impact on the further course of social development. Lenin also developed the Marxist theory of class struggle and the state, in particular the idea of the organization of the state power of the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the form of Soviets. He consistently fought against reactionary bourgeois ideology, revisionism and dogmatism. Lenin's works elevated Marxism as a whole to a higher stage, and that is why this theory is known in the new historical epoch as Marxism-Leninism. Being and Consciousness, Chapter